My name is Evin O'Toole and I'm the Director Curated here. It's a great turnout. Delighted to see so many familiar faces and not familiar faces, so well familiar. For this in conversation this morning, because it is very informal, we invited James Lawlor, who is the Director of Narrative 4, to talk, search with Austin Mc Quinn, the artist, about his work, but quite specifically about the influences of poetry and the poetic imagination on Austin's work. And I think it begins with the title actually, which is Mountains Fall on Us. And it's taken from a poem by Michael Hartnett. And Michael's portrait stands, we say it stands, full centre. And there's a bit of a story connected to that because we acquired it 2 years ago. It's a portrait of Michael done in the early 70s by Edward McGuire. And it went to Washington in the early 70s, and it was purchased by a private collector. And I got wind of the word that it was coming up for auction. We bought it, and it's now in a public collection forever. And it's Michael, who is, of course, from Newcastle West, and a very important Irish poet. So today, as well as the in conversation, we're also going to launch a magnificent, by our standards, by anybody's standards I would say, publication which accompanies the exhibition. And it came yesterday in a van at about 4:15, and everybody was very relaxed, very laid back. It can't remember the catalogue writing, but it did. And in it, for those of you who may not have been at the opening, I think the word that was used to describe it this morning is that it is really energetic, it's really alive, it's a wonderful catalogue, and we're very proud of it. But there is also a very warm and inviting conversation with the curator of the exhibition, Helena Tobin, and Austin. And I think it will also give another kind of bit of information about the scope of the exhibition. I said I'd speak for 90 seconds. I think it might be 120. So with that, and without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to James and Austin, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Una. And I want to thank you and Limerick City Gallery for supporting this work, and if I may take a moment to just acknowledge that support and how important support is to artists. I also want to acknowledge the Arts Council, who've supported me with a bursary to make this work, to Limerick City Gallery for commissioning this exhibition, and just maybe a word about how important as well the curatorial element of this has been. Una's curating of the whole building, and this show in particular. We invited Helena Tobin to curate the work and help me to, I suppose, see through and beyond, my sometimes limited vision. For me, a curator has this gift, is to be able to see through and beyond to the horizon of where the artist is trying to get to. So I've been very privileged to work with Una and Helena, and also to work with my friend in the past, David Cunningham, who I've dedicated this book to David. And he was a best friend of mine, and an architect and curator, and a man of the West. He was born in Galway, and like us, he was looking west, and went to San Francisco, to California, and that's where he excelled really in his gift as curator. But he really supported me throughout. And I suppose a curator for me is someone who knows your practice really well, knows the work and understands you. And I'm delighted to get the opportunity to mention David and to dedicate this publication to his support and his vision. So, with that said, I'm curious, James, as to where we might start talking about what horizons we're going to go and look at.
Well, I was thinking when we start, we'll anchor our conversation today in story, in poetry, place, identity and language, because we met earlier on today. I had met Austin previously at his launch, but he wasn't communicating that day. He had his headpiece on, and so it was great to meet today and swap some stories about, I suppose, about the exhibition and about what inspires your work. So we can start there, if that's okay.
With stories.
Stories.
Well, the great story is The Great Hunger, as a story, to begin with a poem. And I took the title of the first line of The Great Hunger, Kavanagh's poem, as the title of the last piece you see in the exhibition. But it's actually one of the first pieces, that I would have made as well. And I made it, it's called Clay is the Word and Clay is the Flesh. And there's a story I can tell, I suppose, as a way in. I suppose I'm really interested in how things get made. How is art made and how is poetry made? Because they're like assemblages of things, really, of objects, word objects and actual material objects. But those clay tongues, where I'm from in County Kerry, where my dad lives, and where I grew up, is a place called Tonbuy, which is the yellow base or yellow bottom. And the soil and the earth, there's very little soil and an awful lot of mud, is my memory. Right? A lot of clay. And I started working with clay, bought clay, craft clay, to make this tongue sculpture I was making. And I started to think about, well, what is my relationship with clay, really? And I went home to my dad, who's worked with me on 2 pieces on this show, actually. And it was raining, of course, and I said, I was heading down the yard to dig a hole to see how far down will I have to go to meet clay. And Dad was at the back door, and he said, keep digging until you find what you want. Which was very
it's a good metaphor
very
for your life.
Seamus of him, I thought. But that is really the case. I think that you, as a poet, as someone creative, it's the digging down, and that's. I'm sure we'll talk a lot about Hartnett, but it's this digging in and digging deep. So I did find clay. I found enough, to make one tongue, and I said, I think it'll work. So I came back and we dug a lot of clay, and I had to put it through a lot of processes to get my 6 tongues. So there's mother tongue, father tongue, sister tongue, brother tongue, and then all the other tongues that I have known. That's that piece. But what makes it poetry, I suppose? What makes it a poetic object? That's the question, for me, and I suppose that's what I'm seeking all the time, not in a romantic way, and it's a questioning way.
And in that room, or in that exhibition, in that space, just out there to the left, there's bog deal as well.
Yes.
And that's a material that you and your father have worked on as well.
That's right.
Could you tell us about that?
It also came out of the mud. Out of the bog, of course. It's bog deal, like it's not oak. And Ter had been working on this for many years, and then he wasn't working on it for a while. Pieces of bog timber, a lot of people, it's a hobby, craft, and he acquired more of them, and it's quite a lot of work to prepare them. So he does all the hard work, really. And then he gives them to me, and they're all sanded down. And then I soak them in a Chinese ink, so they're matte black. And with these ones, I've studded them with these plastic beads that I found in a skip in London years ago. I didn't know what to do with them. So again, it's an assemblage, it's a kind of a collage, it's a coming together of these things. What interests me, I suppose, is in those bog pieces is as objects, you know, as a poetic object. It's different from just timber, you know. Those trees never died, really. They are submerged into the bog, so they're alive, and then they're preserved. So that's what I think people who work with bog deal and bog timbers are seeing, this energy. And that's what interests me, essentially, is the energy that's inherent in the object already, before I come to it at all. It's already got energy.
Heaney talks about the ghost life of objects, that objects possess kind of a life force beyond the actual object. They kind of possess a memory of a time before and of people, and there's a common connection and a place of belonging that we can find in objects. And I was struck by that by walking around and seeing your use of objects, kind of familiar objects from the household, like Irish dancing medals, but made strange. And they're made strange because we're in an art gallery, they're out of context, but also in the way that you construct them. Is this something that you're concerned with in your work?
The construction, I suppose I am tuning into this inherent energy or history that the object carries already. And I mean, there's something like the clay and the bog oak is very primal, I suppose.
It's from the ground.
Yes, it's not, it's pre-lingual, you know, it has a different kind of primal energy. And I relate to it as a living thing, as a living object myself, you know. I'm trying to find that connection. But with something like the medals, or the Aran sweaters, so they come fully loaded, you know. They're already full of history, energy, tears, and work. And so they contain all of that before I start putting them together in my way. And then they go on and have another life beyond me.
And there's a theme as well, I suppose, in your work. We've talked about ground and being grounded and where you're from, the clay from the land where you're from, the bog deal or the bog oak from the place where you're from. And then there's a theme of kind of rising above. I know one of your pieces, Dharma Above Ground, which as you walked into the foyer there is on your right. It's about rising up from the ground, and that was kind of your anchor piece for this collection. It's called Dharma Above Ground. And so it wasn't the first piece of a series. It was actually, I'd made a series of smaller paintings, and then I wanted to make one large painting. It kind of contains all the code of this language that emerged in my work 3 or 4 years ago. And that painting was shown in Thurles originally, with the bog oak actually. And but for me, that's like the template, or like all the languages in that painting. And I did feel it rose up, you know, it came up. I hadn't been painting for quite a bit. This was a new body of work, and it was a very hard one. It was in pandemic times, so it kind of came directly out, you know. And so it stands there for me. Yeah, it's the first piece you see when you come into the show. It's an important painting, for me.
And it's funny, like it's on this huge orange wall, you know, but when we were hanging that painting, it can go anywhere. It's like that painting can just, you put it on a lorry and it looks good, you know. I don't know why that is. I think it's something to do, it has these qualities, you know. That's me, of course, seeing it that way. And, but some pieces are like that they can summarize, and others are really open. I mean, do you want to talk about the title of the show?
Yeah.
Because we're talking about mountains now, like that is a mountainous shape. You know?
So I know that Una said there the title of the show comes from a Michael Hartnett poem, but
yes.
You do seem to have an affinity with poetry and literature. And what came first? Was it Dharma Above Ground? Was that painting inspired the title, or had you a title in mind? Or
the title came after, and always would, generally, except when Una asked, you know, commissioned this show, the title came straight away. You know, it was like, that's the title, because I have been looking at this, reading this poem. I was going to say looking at it, it's true. You kind of look at a poem sometimes that you know really well. You know, the shape of it, and certainly the title, Mountains Fall on Us. I never
Which
knew.
is biblical.
It is biblical,
yeah.
I know that now. And the poem is a kind of a meditation on Lorca, like scenes from Lorca's life.
So the Spanish poet who was murdered in the Spanish Civil War by the nationalists in 1936, I believe.
The 30s. Yeah, and he was an outsider, like Hartnett himself felt, I think. And Hartnett seemed to really relate to, I think, Lorca's sensibility, you know. But I always looked at this title, I never knew what it was. But that was enough for me. You know, for me, it has to remain open. The poetic object of poetry is an open activity. It's not a closed literature, you know. It's like, otherwise we have an encyclopedia which will explain to us what it is. This does not explain anything, but it is itself, you know,
of course,
complete.
In a biblical sense, it means that mountains fall on us, that people would rather have mountains fall than face the judgment of God. It's kind of a cautionary or a fearful term. And does Hartnett, in this poem, does he carry that weight over that kind of fearful?
That's true, actually. It's like a description, of fear and of punishment that Lorca may have experienced, I suppose.
Because of who
daily,
he was.
And it looks like in a daily basis. So. But there's many different interpretations of the phrase, which originally comes from Isaiah. And it says, the people will ask, call to the mountains, fall on us, rocks cover us, for fear of judgment. You know. But then there's a turn, and actually, Isaiah, as biblical scholars said, well, that's the most poetic book in the library, in the Bible.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where all the poetry is in that. So it's interesting. I've no doubt Hartnett knew where it came from and exactly why he chose it. But there's different interpretations as well, that when later on, you know, people refer back to this phrase, mountains fall on us. So what does it mean? Does it mean a turn to the mountain, you know, turn to nature? You know, Christ then says it on Calvary. He says to the women, you will say, you know, mountains fall on us, rather than, you know, face the terror of what's coming. But then there's other interpretations of that and even in, this is very like Bible studies now, but in that phrase, like it comes after a long passage about rejecting material things, reject the baubles in the material world, reject all the things and the arrogance that you're concerned with, and turn to dust, you know, enter the dust, Christ says. So this is very appealing to me, you know.
Well, the clay, the mountain.
Yeah, and just an act of transformation
ground. That's
beyond, you know, the scale of it, you know, for a mountain to fall on you. It's like, it's very, very wild, imaginative image, you know. He says nothing about it at all. And that's pure poetry to me.
And Hartnett, of course, translated Lorca's Gypsy Ballads into English. Yeah. And the story, I suppose, of that translation was when Hartnett was a young man, he travelled, I suppose, in the late 60s to Spain and was arrested for reciting Lorca in a square in a town, I think in Madrid. And he was jailed for a couple of days, and it caused he had to call the Irish embassy, and he was brought back, and his passport was taken from him, etc. But he used that story later on of what had happened to him. He found Lorca's brother, who was living in New York, and phoned him and told him that story, and asked for the rights to translate Lorca. And his brother straight away over the phone gave him the rights to translate Lorca's Gypsy Ballads, and it forms, I suppose, part of a series of translations that Hartnett did throughout his life. He was, but Lorca, I suppose, is one of the only people from outside of Ireland, because Hartnett was very concerned with people who had gone before him, the 17th century poets who were the last of their time, people like Daithí Ó Brúdar and Hackade, and these poets that were the last of that kind of their class, of that kind of rambling storyteller, the rambling poet. So Hartnett was drawn to the romantic nature, I guess, of Lorca. He found inspiration in his story and an affinity, and he wanted his work to be brought to kind of an Irish audience, and he did that. And so you have this connection with Hartnett. Did you ever meet him?
No. But I know he was still alive when I moved to Dublin. And it was another artist who introduced me to his work, actually. And I had never heard of him. So I identified immediately, I think, with all the contradictions, you know, that he is, and especially in his writing, and abandoning things, like abandoning English and abandoning Irish, and also his interest in the antique and the Attic, you know, through his translations of Ó Brúdar and Orahela. I'm interested in that myself now, in looking at like those engravings that I'm finding and drawing on top of. You know, they're like my translations, I suppose. But I'm interested in, you know, you're talking about him translating. Weren't you telling me about him he translated himself? Like his own name is changed. He changed his own name.
So yeah, he had 3 different versions of his name. So he had his name that he was given, Hartnett, and then he changed it as a young man when he started publishing. So when he first started publishing, it was Hartnett. And then he added a T to it, became Hartnett, because it was closer to the Irish. And then later on, he changed his name to the Irish name, or Hartneda. So there's these different versions of himself that he went with. So like you were asking me, because I have in some of his early work where it's Hartnett, but he has a different surname. The name on his tombstone is different to the name that is on his father's tombstone, which is quite interesting. That he was searching for a sense of identity, a return to who he really was, and that can be seen in his Irish work, his Irish language poetry, which is quite different to his English language poetry, which is quite different to the work he did. He wrote poems for his father, so he wrote like Maiden Street Ballad, which are quite popular now. So there was different versions of the same man, and there's the rural poet, because he was fostered out to his grandmother in kind of rural, outside Newcastle West, a place called Camas. The urban poet, or the town poet, where he grew up in a town, but also the Dublin poet. And you can see that in his life's work. And you were saying you kind of have an affinity with that idea of
you're kind of going sideways at things, you know, not like if he was a good boy and stayed in the straight line, you know, and only wrote his, you know, sonnets, You know, he'd be all the way, he'd be fine. But he couldn't, and he had to try all these other things. But I was fascinated with the story of him changing his name, because I said, well, that's truly, a poetic act, because he's not afraid to actually alter his own name, not for pride, or for some kind of ego satisfaction, but purely to serve the name correctly. That the translation is incorrect. And so the translation from Hartnett to Hartnett, he corrected it and was prepared to sacrifice his actual name for the sake of that action,
There is very much a sense with Hartnett of kind of peeling back that colonization process, of trying to go back to a time before, I suppose, before colonization, or before English language changed our culture, because the language changed. And of course Hartnett in the 70s decided, to stop writing in English, even though he was recognized as an English or as a poet, and he changed his name to his Irish name, and he said that he would not write in English again, that English was only, he said in jest, but English was only a language fit to sell pigs in. And that was clever, because of course English was the commercial language. You could only trade in English. You were only allowed trade in English in the 17th century. And he said that that poetry is a rebel act, that by the very act of writing poetry is rebellious. And do you follow that sentiment, or?
I mean, it's in my press release. But because it's such an attractive idea, that we're rebels, as artists. But it's not, it's kind of heroic in some way. But I think for me, what he was doing it was torment for him, it seemed to me, to abandon English and then to return to English was even much, much harder. And he said, they'll all come for me now, because but now after I said I was doing Never Again, and now he's back. That's when he wrote Inchicore Haiku. And it was the last couple of years of his life. So rebelliousness, yes. I think I'm interested, I suppose, in challenging things. I think that's one of the jobs of a poet and an artist, is to question language. I think that's what he was doing. I don't think he was, really, it was an anti-colonialist act, that had some kind of bayonet attached to it. It was really questioning the language as an object, and how was he going to continue to accommodate all his own histories and all of the complications around language, a language. It's not like a farewell to Spanish, I understand that, because, it's very specifically English. But it would liberate him for a period. He wrote marvelous work, and then he returned, with these haiku, and which really are like stars now. They're the stars that we can look at. But the rebel thing is, of course, interesting. Yeah.
And I'm struck by, I suppose, your work is very much, we see these familiar objects, as I said, but familiar poems are also like familiar objects in terms of they have this kind of common emotional ground. And sometimes it can be a source of common trauma when we think of poems we learned off in Leaving Cert, like The Great Hunger. I had that in my Leaving Cert. But they're kind of become part of us, these common objects, where it's images that we have in our homes, and you've displayed some of them, like the indulgences that were common, I suppose, in the 40s and 50s. But that these common objects become part of our culture, part of our imagination. And I think your work is concerned with exploring those common objects, isn't it? And I'm really thinking of the tower, or the iron jumpers, the Tower of Iron Jumpers. Could you talk about maybe the making of that and what inspired that object?
I mean, we must come back to empathy, though, and the work that
Yeah.
you're doing with empathy. But the tower, yeah, it is challenging. I suppose, and collecting the medals and indulgences and religious objects, and other kind of iconic tropes of identity and national identity, for me it's a kind of an overcoming of these things. It's not, it's my way, personal, it's very personal. You know, it's just my way of overcoming something like how a Tower of Arran can be a celebration of your national identity or totally a prison. You know, a tower is a place of imprisonment for some people. People need to leave their identity. They leave their nation to become themselves. I think Hartnett really struggled with those. Was really interested in those dynamics. You know, so that tower has all of those things for me.
And there's a sense of texture to it. I suppose I suppose it's in common knowledge. I suppose that different families will have different patterns in their Arran jumpers, and when you put them all together, including with some of them have tea stains on them, you get this sense of
Some kind of stain.
you get this sense of the kind of the nearly like an Aboriginal form of art that these Arran jumpers. It was coming from, there was a necessity, but also it was art that these families carried on, this pattern, because it was what their parents did or their grandparents did, and they passed it down. And it was kind of like an Aboriginal nearly form or native form of art. And that really comes to the fore when you see these patterns that you've merged together.
Mm. There was a poet, an American poet, visited the show here, you know, and on Instagram he put up a picture of that tower, and he said he called it a ghost tower, and I thought it was so poetic. You know, only a poet would see that. You know, that it was a ghost of a tower that I had made, which of course completely satisfied me and answered. Oh, that's what I was doing. You know, it took another poet to see that. Yeah. So it's some people have found it very moving, you know, because it does contain all those histories, or it should overcome all of those things and become a piece of large or monumental minimalist sculpture. You know.
And where did you source the jumpers? Was it
over about 2 years, I collected them mostly from charity shops, car boot sales. So it was a time when that part of our emblem of our nationality was being flung out, you know, and because we were international now. And so I was picking these up. It was like abundant material for me, you know. My mother was collecting them. Everybody was collecting them for me, you know. And so I cut them and sewed them in together. And so I had to take them apart and then put them back together. But a lot of the sources of my work are art supplies, charity shops, and waste treatment centres. So they're the kind of areas that I'm very comfortable in. Like what's discarded, what's outside, you know, and what is there plenty of that I can manipulate and turn into something else. So it's the act of transformation. I think is really important. That's the poetic act. That's the rebel act, actually. It's to take the thing that's disgusting, that's flung, you know.
make it into something new?
Yeah, gold. Actually, David Cunningham, who the book is dedicated to, he wrote a piece on my work one time, and he said, what he thought I was doing was forging glitter from dross, and that was thinking that was going to be a title for this show, because it identifies so much what I think I'm about anyway, you know, what I'm interested in.
I'm always struck by poets who are, especially from the west of Ireland. I'm we're from West Limerick, and I suppose a special kind of affinity with Michael Hartnett. When I was growing up, people would be talking about this poet Hartnett and what he was doing, but how, as an artist, you can be part of a community, but also apart from it. You know, and Kavanagh is a little bit like that. You know, when he's talking about like Inniskeen Road in July evening, the bicycles go by in twos and threes. There's a dance in Billy Brennan's barn tonight. He's part of this community, but also as the outsider. And I suppose your exhibition launch here that I attended, I suppose around a month ago now, you were dressed in, you were performing at it, and you were part of the exhibition, but you were also apart from it. You didn't have to. You didn't have to do the common mingling of what an artist normally does at their launch. But I was really struck by that's to me what the statement you were making. And I know that was inspired by a Hartnett poem as well, a different poem, wasn't it?
Well, again, like I took his title. Yeah, it came afterwards. I didn't know what to call this performance piece that I wanted to make for the opening. It was like, for me, performance is really, or live art is it's just making images, you know, with my body alive, as a living sculpture. This is the only way I can do this, you know, is by putting on these knitted toys and standing in this way. And so that's the image I want to make. But just before, when I had all the things assembled and the ribbons and the music and the whole thing, I said, yeah, I'm sure the title of this piece is in Michael Hartnett. And it was. And that's where I found The Black Sheep as the title. And it's a poem that he wrote dedicated to Paul Durcan, actually. And he talks about this head, the head of the poet. You know, and I was wearing this enormous head of Teddy's. And he says, this head, let the bourgeoisie beware. This head contains a galaxy. You know. So it's not me, of course. You know, I am there, by the way, in the performance. I am still myself, but I'm not an actor. You know, so I have no training at all. I'm completely there and completely terrified. You know. But the image I know is being made. So
those lines are, if any of you are familiar with the statue of Michael Hartnett, there's a Rory Breslin statue in the square in Newcastle West, and those lines are actually in stone around the statue. Like, this poet's head holds a galaxy, which a line from that poem. And interestingly, Paul Durcan actually launched the statue, I suppose, in 2011, 2012. In Newcastle West, which was a big occasion for the town. They were honouring, you know, I suppose one of their kind of most famous figures that people had a sense of pride that you find in Ireland, especially with regards writers, where towns, you see it in Listowel with John B. Keane, and Newcastle West, Michael Hartnett. There's a sense of pride of place. But I was saying to you earlier, when Paul Durcan launched the statue, he didn't want it covered, but he put a graduation gown on the statue. And before he took off the graduation gown, he just jumped up on the stone. He whispered in its ear, and he just took off the gown. And it was just a magical piece of performance, really. But it's interesting that your work is so, I suppose, inspired by the literary word. And was poetry always like a central kind of interest of yours?
I think so. I think generally, broadly, music is, you know, a huge part of my existence. And poetry, I suppose, yeah, I feel close to the making of than the writing of a novel. You know, I feel closer to the poetic act, the reducing of things, the material, the connection to the words, like in a deep way. You know.
And the story, you're interested in story.
Story, and then as the way to overcoming something else, as the way to going beyond anything, beyond, over the horizon. You know. So the story is the way in. You know. but the action is the key thing, and just being creative, you know. It's not about being museumified. I think, you know, it's interesting how the perception of Michael Hartnett is changing. We were talking about someone doing a display of trinkets from his grandmother's kitchen or something. How there's a sense where he's, well, that rebelliousness might be being, let's say, softened.
Yes, yeah. Yes, I suppose especially when you the collected poems and it's edited from, it's not the poet himself or herself editing it. There is a danger of it being sanitized, and Michael was quite was a controversial figure even within the town. You know, he wrote about the class structure. He wrote about the Catholic Church. And, you know, he was writing in the late 50s, early 60s about the Catholic Church. He was writing about the publicans. He was barred from a number of pubs for writing about the publicans at one stage. But he saw the role as an artist as being outspoken, to use his voice to speak for people who had no voice. And I know that's kind of an interest of yours as well. Or
Yeah, well, I was thinking about, because there's so much nostalgia, you know. There's even, you know, nostalgia in my own work, you know, iron sweaters and medals and so on. How can this be current, you know? I was thinking about this, like, where is this work now? You know, how is poetry effective now? And on my phone, as if by, to answer my question, someone had posted a part of the manifesto, which I brought with me, from the Palestinian artist, the Palestinian Pavilion in Venice, right now. And the Palestinian artists decided they were closing their pavilion, and instead they posted this as an act of boycott, really, of the Biennale. And but their manifesto says this, if you don't mind. Maybe we'd finish with this, because
I have a few questions.
Yeah, we'd love some questions. But these artists say art and poetry represent our liberated knowledge, freed from the belly of the beast. This moment demands that we claim our political agency in its clarity. It empowers us to turn imagination into affirmative action. And that is poetry. That's what he was doing, turning imagination into action, forging poetic structures of collectivity, and a return to the essence of our humanity. And then they say, we belong to the world, to the earth, to the land. Through this agency, we move, act, refuse to be silent accomplices to the state's atrocities. We cannot ignore the oppressive conditions under which creativity thrives. I mean, that completely sums up Michael Hartnett to me. You know, it was the oppression, you know, that he felt, that he had to come out from under it in some way. And that meant things like abandoning language. And they say, faced with censorship or co-option, we must resist glorifying the regime or fading into obscurity. So in order to do that,
rise up.
A rebel act.
Thank you very much. So we have time for a couple of questions, if anyone in the audience would like to ask Austin any questions about his work, or see a question here.
I'm very curious about the link. As I was going around, and at the last room on the TV was the room away in the coffee shop, and a lot of the paintings, most of the paintings were kind of quite heavy and somber, and as you say, from the attic. And then suddenly there's this pink, and they're just gorgeous. I love those paintings. I'm curious about the pink. Where did it come from? What's the thinking behind it?
It was, a few things came together. I started working with, I started finding these engravings of Lady Butler's war paintings. You know, she was a neighbour of mine, you know, in another century. And she was a superstar artist who did a lot of work on military campaigns, and these paintings were very popular in solicitors' offices and, you know, banks and so on. And again, I'm just finding them cardboard sale and being thrown out, in terrible condition. So I'm interested in them as paintings because she was quite an astonishing painter. And around the same time, a friend of mine gave me a jar of that pink ink. And I said, you might have a use for that. So, but there is a connection, and sometimes you don't know what the connection is. But when I was applying it on top of these war and military images, I started thinking about that pink camera that they use, that military campaigns use to identify enemies. It's a filter that picks up, in military surveillance. It's that colour, actually. So, but that came after. I had used the pink because they needed to be elevated. I needed to bring them to now, and fight against the nostalgia. I think, yeah.
Because you're not interested, you're trying to avoid the confessional.
Yes. No, not interested in that at all.
Anyway. When you draw over those images, piles of something, are they tongues as well? Do they refer back to tongues, which what they think?
No, but it's interesting. You saw tongues there. Yeah. No, not deliberately. No. I mean, I have names for what they are, but it's like a language. It's like there's like 5 or 6. There's oysters and buttons and the different elements that have formed this language. And I do them. I have to do them all in one go almost. Once I start them. So I mightn't do anything for a long time like those Lady Butler paintings. So I have to look at them and live with them for a long time. It's not unusual. Agnes Martin, I think, used to have a similar kind of process. And then you're ready, and then it's go. And I will just keep going until it's done. Because that's the energy of the piece, really. So they're not really specifically anything. They're like very highly developed doodles, really. Yeah. It's kind of a doodling.
Anyone else?
You talked about the black and white squiggly thing with lines.
The zigzags. Yes, that's an upholstery fabric that I've used. It's furnishing fabric that you can't get into anymore. It wasn't very popular, but it was an Italian furnishing fabric, and I think I use it in those panels as like places of resonance. So it's allowing some resonance from the paintings out and kind of amplifying or articulating sound for me. So they're like soundboards of some of the kind of energy that's going on. Well, say the one in the foyer here, for me, they're kind of useful in the way they bring some of the energy of the painting out and onto the floor and out and across the room. So they're like extending some of that liveness, I suppose, for me, in a more formal way. Yeah. Does that answer?
Essentially.
Time for 1 or 2 more questions. If there aren't, we
come with my whatever is here. I think probably just to go, if people have the time to go and immerse themselves again in the exhibition, would be just a really very productive thing and a very rewarding thing. But before you do that, I just want to say my thanks to James and Austin for that really wonderfully illuminating conversation. And bringing Michael so much into the conversation, which I suppose I hadn't expected, but I'm only thrilled that it happened. I can say that I did know him, and I worked with him, and that was also interesting. I would have met him through Nuala McGonagall, because he would have translated a lot of her work into English. But yeah, just the sincerity of your work and the gravity of it as well, it really came through, I think, in the conversation today. And thank you for shaping it as well, James. It was a lovely little walk, a ramble, if you like, to go on. But as the original shopkeeper's daughter, I'm actually here today to also, well not here, but to launch the publication, which really we're extremely proud of, and for which I really need to thank Austin for, really pushing it. Had a very clear sense of what he wanted to achieve, and we are very proud to be associated with it. It is on Bark and Basements Day, today and today only, for €25. After today, it will be 30. So anybody who would like to purchase a copy, it also includes a very fine conversation with Helena Tobin, the curator of this show. There are one or two people and organisations that I forgot to acknowledge at the beginning, so before I forget, Eamon, you're here, the photographer who took all of the images, and most of them at least, is here, so thank you very much. But also to Poetry Ireland, who have supported this event, again, drawing in other organisations to support the visual. Unfortunately, Liz Kelly, the director, was meant to be here, but she couldn't make it. But I just want to acknowledge their support. But principally, again, Austin, thank you for that wonderful journey that you brought us on today. And James.